It's time to close out our series of lectures on biases by talking about something called time-based biases that arise when you have a study that uses time as an important variable in some way. So the goals here are to define immortal time bias and lead time bias. These are both forms of information bias, but they take kind of a special form, so it's definitely worth talking about in a bit more detail. We'll talk about why they're hard to notice and give you some examples and give you an intuition as to when they may be present. But before we begin with some actual medical studies, I want to once again give you an opportunity to buy my amazing crystal here. You may remember that my prior study suggesting that this crystal would increase your income was outed as a complete fraud, but no worries. It has now been rebranded as a survival stone, and I have a new study to tell you about. This study confirms beyond a shadow of a doubt that getting this stone increases your likelihood of survival. So what we did is we randomized patients in the intensive care unit, very sick patients, the sickest of the sick, to either get my amazing survival stone on day 3 of their stay or not. And look at the results. The death rate of those exposed to the stone was 30%, but it was 50% in those who didn't get the stone. That's a p-value of less than 0.0001, amazingly statistically significant, and this time I guarantee it is not a fraud. These results are not the result of fraud. So now, are you going to buy my stone? Well, okay, there's one thing I have to tell you about this study. Remember that we gave them the stone on day 3 of their ICU stay, and when I did the analysis, I analyzed everyone who came into the ICU, including those people who may have died on day 1 and 2 of their intensive care unit stay. And so there's a bit of a problem here, right? Because those patients who didn't even make it to day 3 never had a chance to get randomized to receive the stone or not, and yet I included them in the no stone group. That, unfortunately, is a bit of bias. And in fact, that bias is enough to make this stone look like it works when it actually doesn't work at all. I'm sorry, I just can't lie to you after all we've been through together. So this is a form of bias that is actually prevalent in the medical literature, and I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples now. Let's start with the Academy Award. So this is a study appearing in the Annals of Internal Medicine. It's published in 2001. Annals is a good medical journal, peer-reviewed. Survival and Academy Award-winning actors and actresses. What they did is they took everyone who has won an Academy Award and compared them to everyone who has been nominated for an Academy Award but didn't win. And they just looked at how long these people lived. You know, these are famous people. We know how old they were when they died. And what you can see are the survival curves here. And you can see a difference between those two curves, suggesting that the Academy Award winners lived a little bit longer, about a year or 2 longer on average, than those who were merely nominated for an Academy Award. The conclusion of the study was there's something so validating about winning an Academy Award, some beneficial effect that it can actually extend your life. It's sort of a compelling idea that recognition from your peers is that powerful. But in fact, this is the result of one of our time-based biases, something called immortal time bias. And here's how it works. Imagine we weren't comparing Academy Award winners to Academy Award nominees. Imagine we were comparing Academy Award winners to people who have never won an Academy Award or been nominated, like me or you. Well, it wouldn't surprise you to find that Academy Award winners live longer, right? Because a lot of people don't live long enough to even be considered for an Academy Award, right? You have to be grown up and have an acting career and be in a bunch of movies to get an Academy Award in general. You know, there's some young people, right? So if we're comparing to the general population, there are unfortunately, there are kids who died in accidents and people who got cancer and all those people that just never have an opportunity to even be considered for an Academy Award. So you wouldn't be that surprised that Academy Award winners live longer. Well, it's the same thing, although more subtle, for nominees. You get nominated for an Academy Award often when you're younger than when you actually win the Academy Award. A lot of people get nominated sort of multiple times before they win, or nominated and never win. But the average age of a nominee is younger, which means that to make it to be an Academy Award winner, a length of time had to pass. If you had died in that length of time, well, then you wouldn't have been an Academy Award winner, and you would have been assigned to the potentially nominee group if you'd been nominated before. That is exactly the same as with my crystal stone when I assigned people to the non-crystal group even though they died before day 3. So this is called immortal time bias. There's this time prior to receiving an Academy Award where you're not allowed to die because if you did, you wouldn't have received the Academy Award. When this study was reanalyzed, accounting for that immortal time bias, the difference went away. So all you're seeing here is an example of the fact that the average Academy Award winner is older than the average Academy Award nominee. Here's another example appearing in the journal Diabetologia in 2006. It was looking at the self-monitoring of blood glucose in individuals with type 2 diabetes. And so monitoring of blood glucose, is checking your blood sugars. And in type 2 diabetes, many patients do this every day, but some people don't. They don't check it. They just kind of take certain medications and hope for the best. And what this study showed, if you look at the graph, was that people who check their blood sugar frequently lived longer, which was a good story, right? Check your blood sugar, keep an eye on things. But if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see it's another example of immortal time bias. Here's what happened. Quote, self-monitoring of blood glucose was assigned at baseline if a patient ever monitored blood glucose themselves for at least 1 year. Parse that sentence a little bit. The group that they called the self-monitoring group was assigned at the baseline even if they self-monitored for a year 10 years after baseline. We've just now introduced immortal time bias because on average, if you are surviving longer, you have a greater chance to have a year where you're good about self-monitoring your glucose. And if we assign you to the self-monitoring group back at the start of the study, even if it's 5 years before you start self-monitoring, well, then that's 5 years of immortal time bias there. And in fact, when you reanalyze this study, accounting for the fact that they were using this future information, what you actually found was that the hazard ratio for self-monitoring of blood glucose was 1.95. In fact, the people who self-monitored did worse overall. And that actually makes sense because it tends to be that sicker people with worse, more difficult to control diabetes are the ones who are checking more often, right? Their doctors are kind of cracking the whip and saying, you got to get on top of this. So this is not at all something that is rare. You really do have to think about it. It shows up a lot. And it leads me to my 11th commandment of statistics. I shall not use future information in my statistical models. Future information is whenever you use something that you'll find out about the patient in the future, but assign it to baseline. So in this example, we said, okay, we're going to assign this patient to the self-monitoring group, even though that information that they are a self-monitoring person wouldn't come out for another 5 years. You cannot use future information in your baseline models. It always adds to immortal time bias. So the stuff that you can consider at baseline is stuff that is present at baseline. We can't analyze someone when they're 5 years old as a lottery winner when they win the lottery at age 30. It's not fair. You can only use factors present at baseline. So how do you fix immortal time bias? Well, there's a couple of different ways. One way is, as I said, you can just use baseline data, right? You just assign the patient based on whether they are a glucose self-checker at the moment they enter the study, as opposed to at any time in the future of the study. Alternatively, there's something called time-varying analysis. This is a little statistically tricky, but what you need to know is that you appreciate the fact that a patient can kind of switch from one group to another. So instead of assigning them as a self-checker at baseline and forevermore, everyone starts as a non-self-checker, and then when they have a year that they're doing good and self-checking their glucose, they enter the self-checker group. If they then have a year where they're doing bad, they leave the self-checker group, and you can sort of statistically model them bouncing between the groups, and in that way fairly compare the effect of self-checking on the ultimate outcome. It's a little tricky, but you need to think about this if you're not going to just use baseline variables at baseline. Let's move on to something called lead time bias, which is when detection of a disease occurs earlier, making it appear that survival time has increased. So look at this graphic. This is a graphic that's displaying this idea that, let's say that there's a cancer that is particularly deadly. And we invent a new test to detect this cancer earlier. Well, we might detect the cancer a year earlier than our conventional testing would. So we would say, okay, we've got the time between cancer detection and death has now gone from maybe 5 years to 6 years. And we might be very impressed, say, oh, this test is so great. Look, people who get this test live longer. Well, no, not really. We just diagnosed them a year earlier. That's called lead time bias. This happens in not just cancer studies, but other studies as well. Here's a study called Effective Glomerular Filtration Rate at Dialysis Initiation on Survival in Patients with Advanced Chronic Kidney Disease. That's a mouthful of a study. But what you need to know about this study is that patients with kidney disease often worsen over time and come to a point where they may need to start dialysis, which is a therapy that replaces the kidney function. You may have seen people on dialysis. It's that machine that sort of cleans the blood a few times a week. Now, as the kidney function declines, there's a time where you have to say, okay, let's start dialysis now. And it can be a discussion that lasts months or years, depending on how fast the kidney function is declining. There's a substantial question out there. Should we start earlier when there's still a bit of kidney function left, or later when there's like no kidney function left, but it's more of an emergency? This introduces a lead time bias problem, right? Because if I adopt a policy of starting earlier, well, then I'm going to assign my patient to the dialysis group earlier in time. And I might find that their time surviving on dialysis is longer because I simply started them earlier on dialysis. Well, that doesn't mean that it was a right choice to start them earlier, right? How do you account for this? The best way to account for this is randomization. You take your patients at that early time point and you randomize them to either start dialysis or wait, and that's when the clock starts ticking. So you follow them forward from that point in time, not the point in time when they actually start dialysis, if that makes sense. So in that way, randomization has cured your lead time bias because everyone's clock starts at exactly the same time. Now, if you're reading about lead time bias, you might come across length time bias. This is an interesting sort of subtle bias that comes up in screening tests. And what you need to know here is that screening tests are good at capturing people with slow-growing disease, but not people with rapidly progressive disease. So think of something like prostate cancer, which is typically kind of a slow, indolent disease that occurs over years, but there is a subtype of prostate cancer, very aggressive, kind of comes up very quickly. Well, who is the screening test going to diagnose with prostate cancer? Well, it's going to diagnose the people with slow-growing disease because the chance of catching the rapidly appearing aggressive disease is just smaller because it appears so rapidly. But if the disease is sitting there for years and years in a more or less quiescent state, you've got lots of opportunity to catch it. So screening tests in general are better at catching slow-growing disease. Slow-growing disease is also generally better for you, right? Like a slow cancer that's sort of plodding along, you're going to live longer than a rapidly progressive, aggressive cancer. This is called length time bias. What it will make it appear that your screening test is protective in some way because the people you're diagnosing tend to have less severe disease. Again, the way you fix this problem is randomization. You take everyone and you randomize them to the screening test versus no screening test and follow them from that point in time forward. So time-based biases are tricky. You have to think about them anytime you have a study that is potentially using information from the future and assigning it at the baseline inception point of the study. So, take-home points. When you're talking about time, be careful. Immortal time bias occurs when you assign someone to a category at baseline based on a future piece of data, which leads us to our important point: never use future information in your studies. Lead time bias is when you diagnose a disease earlier, but it doesn't make a difference. The solution there is to randomize. Length time bias is really a form of selection bias where you are selecting for slowly progressive disease. Again, randomize, 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 and be careful anytime there's time in one of your studies. I'll see you next time.